Have you ever had a déjà vu moment? You could be walking down the street, and suddenly it feels like you've been here before. You try to shake off the feeling, but then you notice small things are off. The building numbers seem to be different, and people are staring at you as if you're not supposed to be there. Just when you're about to break into a cold sweat, you come to your senses, realizing it was just an intense déjà vu moment. Well, what if we told you that it was actually a glimpse into another reality? Someone else may have already made the jump between realities. A man named Joe from South Carolina woke up one morning in 2016 to find out that he'd experienced a weird déjà vu moment. He walked into the living room and saw his wife watching television. But it wasn't the program playing on the screen that caught his attention. It was something else entirely. It was the fact that his wife didn't recognize him. "I don't know why I did it," she said, "but I think I called the cops." Joe was confused. He asked her why she would call the police on him, but instead of answering, she continued to stare at him with fear in her eyes. She said, "Don't you recognize me?" That's when Joe realized he didn't. He looked at the woman he'd known for years as his wife and couldn't place her. All he could remember was that her name started with a K. But as he stared at her, trying to piece together who she was, everything began to feel odd. As he scanned the rest of the house, he noticed that the pictures on the walls were all wrong. They weren't pictures of his family or vacations they'd taken together. They were pictures of a man and a woman he didn't know. Panicked, he rushed to the bathroom to look in the mirror. When he turned the faucet on, the water that filled the sink was black. Then he saw the face staring back at him from the mirror. It wasn't his own. In fact, the person in the mirror didn't seem to have any recollection of who he was. At first, Joe thought he might be having some kind of psychotic break, but when he tried to pick up the phone to call his brother, he noticed that the phone was a rotary phone from the 1970s. But he knew that was impossible because he'd bought a brand new smartphone just 2 days prior. After calling his brother and getting no answer, Joe decided to step outside. But the moment he opened the front door, he noticed that the street sign indicated that he lived on a completely different street. And it wasn't the street he knew. He recognized the houses though. They were his neighbors, but none of them seemed to recognize him. When he mentioned his name, they responded by saying, "Who's that?" People were staring at him as he walked through town, whispering and pointing. All Joe could think about was how much time he'd wasted thinking about what to wear that morning. He'd chosen a t-shirt that said Iron Maiden on the front and black jeans. But when he looked down, he realized that he was wearing clothes that he hadn't owned since high school. Was he going crazy? Had he somehow managed to slip into a parallel universe? He ended up at a local bar, desperate for answers. Joe sat down on a stool and asked the bartender if he could get a beer. As the bartender reached for the tap, Joe asked a question that was burning in his mind. "Can you tell me anything about myself?" The bartender looked at him and replied, "Do I know you?" Confused, Joe explained that he was trying to remember who he was, what his life was like. Maybe the bartender would know? But unfortunately, the bartender had no idea who Joe was. He even asked Joe, "Are you sure you're okay?" It was only then that Joe remembered the Blackwater. Of course he wasn't okay. Joe pulled out his wallet to show the bartender a photo of himself. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, hoping that maybe the man in the photo would ring a bell. But the bartender looked at the photo and simply shook his head. At that point, Joe gave up. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in a hospital bed. Nurses and doctors were standing over him, asking if he remembered what had happened. But he didn't. All he could remember was being in a bar and drinking a strange blue liquid before passing out. When he looked around, he saw a familiar face. It was his wife, but she looked scared. She asked, "What's the last thing you remember?" Joe lied and said, "You were there. We were arguing, and then I blacked out." Joe went home that day and tried to go to work, but he kept getting interrupted by people asking, "Are you sure you're okay?" They also questioned whether he had enough money to pay for his bus ticket and asked him to take a breath and walk slowly. It was clear that they thought he was having a psychotic break. Then he started to remember more. It came to him in fragments. He remembered his father dying when he was young, but he also remembered his father shaking his hand when he graduated from college. That shouldn't have been possible. Then he remembered a war he'd been part of, but he had no record of serving in the military. Memories continued to flood back. Memories that didn't add up. That night, Joe decided to get to the bottom of it. He went to the basement and took out a box filled with childhood mementos. When he opened the box, he found a photo album. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed that none of the photos matched the memories that he had. Some of the photos showed a boy with a missing front tooth standing next to a man who Joe knew was his father. But in his memories, his father had always been too busy to spend time with him. Joe felt a sudden sense of dread creep up his spine. He shut the photo album quickly and returned it to the box. Something else caught his eye. A teddy bear dressed in a miniature army uniform. Joe didn't remember having such a toy, but when he touched it, a memory flashed in his mind. He was holding the bear in his arms while wearing a military uniform. It looked like he had been preparing for battle. As Joe continued sifting through the items in the box, he came across a letter addressed to him. He opened the envelope and read the letter. It was written by his mother. In the letter, She explained that he had been born in a different country and that his father had been a soldier, but he was supposed to have died in infancy. So how was he alive? Was it possible that he'd somehow slipped into an alternate reality? He still doesn't know the answer to those questions, but he knows that he's not alone. He may have inadvertently created another version of himself in the process of jumping realities. Before he left that basement, Joe found another box filled with letters, some of which were from a girl named Amanda. They were love letters that expressed how much she cared for him. But the scariest part wasn't that she'd written them to him, but that he had written them to her as well. And the date on the letters suggested that he had sent them months before he even met her. He searched the rest of the house, looking for anything that could help him understand what was happening to him. In his study, he found a globe. It was an old one, unlike any he'd seen before. There were countries on it that didn't exist anymore, like East and West Germany. Then he noticed something strange. The continent of Africa wasn't connected to Asia. After searching his entire house, he still had more questions than answers. Who was the man in the mirror? Why did his wife not recognize him? And how was he supposed to return home? He decided to visit a friend of his, Robert, hoping he could make sense of the jumbled mess of memories that Joe had shared with him over the phone. Robert was willing to listen without judgment, and that's exactly what Joe needed. Joe began telling Robert about his strange situation, starting with the missing piece of Africa on the globe. Robert stopped him right there. Africa has always had a land bridge connecting it to Asia, he said. So Joe realized he wasn't crazy. He had jumped into an alternate universe where continents were shaped differently and memories were altered. But there was one part of his story that puzzled Robert. Why do you think you've jumped universes? How can you be so sure it wasn't just a psychotic episode? Joe replied, because I have proof. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo of himself with his friends from high school. On the back of the photo, someone had written the year it had been taken. But when Joe turned it over, he saw that the year was 2024. Since then, Joe has gone to the authorities with his story, but they haven't been able to help him. He feels like he's being gaslit, and he's desperate to get back to his reality. He has no choice but to keep searching for answers on his own. Joe's story raises more questions than it answers. Is there really such a thing as an alternate universe? And if so, how does one get there? Or is Joe's story a cautionary tale of what can happen when our minds play tricks on us? Only time will tell if Joe manages to find his way back home, or if he is destined to remain in this strange new world forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the next one, and don't forget to hit subscribe.